There are currently 3 different versions of the ending of Injustice: Gods Among Us. There's the original game, the comic version from Injustice Ground Zero, and the animated movie version. Observing the differences between these versions and trying to understand the motivations behind how the 3 play out distinctly from one another can tell you a lot about the process of adaptation and the needs of each medium. Let's start with the game version. In case you somehow aren't aware, Injustice is set in a world where the Joker nuked Metropolis and Superman became a murderous dictator after being tricked into killing his pregnant wife. Batman stood in opposition, creating an insurgency to oppose Superman's regime, with the heroes and villains of the DCU being split between the two. Then, 5 years into the conflict, Batman and Lex Luthor summon uncorrupted counterparts from a more traditional DCU to help stop Superman. The game's climax sees the Superman of the Prime Universe being brought over by the two Batmen to even the odds and square off with his regime counterpart. After besting the regime's heavy hitters, he faces off with Ubermensch in the Fortress of Solitude and defeats him. Regime Batman and the Prime heroes we followed throughout the game then arrive to be present for the outcome they've been fighting for this entire time. For all of its faults, there are several positives with this outcome. Mirror matches were previously unheard of in these story modes, so it makes for a neat set piece that they utilised 5 times in the game. Remember, this is years before it became an overused trope. But more than that, it's thematically cathartic to see this wretched excuse for a Superman who has fallen so far be bested by the true Blue Boy Scouts and prove that the real Superman is righteous and thus superior. Just ignore all those civilians he killed on the way here, that was an oversight. The weakness of this version is that, narratively, it's very unsatisfying since this Clark has barely appeared before now, and having him swoop in to deal with the regime by himself in an afternoon effectively renders everything the Prime League and the Insurgency have done to fight against Superman up to now moot. Sadly, this issue would only become worse in the comic version. Injustice Ground Zero is the conclusion to the first 5 years of the comic story. It presumably exists for the benefit of non-gaming fans who simply got invested in the comic and would feel disregarded if forced to go play this fighting game just to see where this comic story goes. Ground Zero is essentially a Cliff Notes version of the game, telling a lot of important moments in montage or otherwise condensed retellings that feel at odds with the more deliberate pacing of the comic up to now. The penultimate issue ends with Prime Superman's arrival, and the final depicts his story mode chapter on 2 times speed. But even if this were paced better, the issue the game has narratively is even worse here. The game is told from the perspective of the Prime Leaguers, so them beating the regime is just par for the course for this type of story. But as mentioned, Superman's arrival causes problems because he's not been here until now. For the comic, the Prime League are not the protagonists, the Insurgency are. The Prime Leaguers are now this 11th hour ass pull that resolves the conflict our heroes have been trying to win for like 68 issues and 5 annuals over the span of 4 real world years. I can imagine a lot of comic-only fans feeling let down by this climax. Hence the addition Ground Zero makes. In addition to telling the story for non-gamer fans, it's also allowed the writers to address the inconsistent characterization of Harley Quinn between the two mediums when they're ostensibly set in the same continuity. See, Game Harley is depressed and easily latches onto the next Joker to enter her life, akin to Arkhamverse Harley. In the comic, however, Harley received much more attention and development, able to move on from the Joker and become like her New 52 incarnation, akin to Kill the Justice League Harley. It's that jarring. So, after seeing the game from the perspective of a Harley who is now depicted as struggling with her desires and working for Joker under duress because he's threatening to kill her friends if she doesn't comply, she gets to take Joker down instead of Lex, since the comic isn't limited by the constraints of the character chapter system of NetherRealm story modes. She is then given a role in helping Prime Clark take down Doomsday by buying Clark time to get his second wind. If you're the sort who cares more about continuity than narrative or themes, which is fine, a lot of comic fans are, Ground Zero being framed as Harley relaying the story to her Prime counterpart allows one to chalk up the errors as being her fudging the details to better inspire her counterpart to abandon her Joker. But then, once Evil Clark is defeated, Regime Batman punches him out, declaring that there's been enough killing. Given he's the protagonist of the comic, letting him have this moment is important for making the regime cast struggle feel like it mattered, but not as much as it needed to. Unfortunately, there's only so much wiggle room the comic had because it was bound by the canon of the games, which themselves would later disregard bits of comic canon at their discretion. Had they gone in their own direction instead, it would have worked better, I think, allowing the comic writers to create a new finale where the Insurgency cast get to resolve the struggle on their own. And that's the advantage the movie version was given. The movie is not a straight adaptation of existing expanded universe material as one might have expected going in. Instead, the movie aimed to be a self-contained take on the concept, drawing primarily from Year 1, but also later arcs as far as the Injustice 2 comics closing arc, and the first game's climax as well. Without the constraints of the game continuity, the movie was able to avoid the legacy problems the comic had been saddled with, from character availability and survival to characterization. Clark and Diana are generally less villainous here, allowing the film's climax to go a very different way, in spite of the similarities to the source material. In this version, the Insurgency still summons a Superman from another Earth to take on his corrupted counterparts, and it's both better and worse than the other versions. On the one hand, Mr. Terrific being the one to come up with the idea instead of Batman and Lex just feels more natural to me. I don't see those two being the sort to think of involving the multiverse to fix their problems, be it a pride thing or just the scale and complexity of the idea. But on the other hand, they'd been driven to desperation over the 5 years of war, with the comic showcasing every other force that could have taken Clark down, each failed to do so. And with their own numbers dwindling from death or defection, an insane idea like this is more reasonable for them to go for than in the film, where it's not even been 1 year yet. Still, they bring him in, on his own, with no Prime League in sight. This makes the idea feel even more random since there's less precedent for the idea in the setting before he comes in. It gains points for spectacle, as the game fight is mostly set in one room of the fortress and the gameplay segment looks kinda janky, while the comic is a handful of panels intercut with Harley beating up the Joker. This one can go all out with the two punching each other miles away, even adapting Clark's super moves from both games. But then the good Superman loses. This works better from a logical standpoint because if two people of equal power face off, the one who holds back the least is the obvious winner, so the Superman who kills logically would defeat a Boy Scout Superman. The only reason we accept the inverse is because it's satisfying to watch a beacon of morality overcome a force of great evil, even if it isn't the most realistic outcome. The film has evil Clark win, and then the real plan comes into play. Lois from another universe, not even the same one as the other Clark. Using Lois instead serves as a statement, intentional or otherwise. Regime Clark is a good man who lost his way, gave in to despair and became a villain, now willing to commit acts of great evil. They are tackling the disease, not the symptoms. Clark is driven by his warped view of who Lois was, so the only way to stop him truly is to bring the real Lois to him and snap him out of his delusions. You often cannot defeat evil with force, but with understanding and seeking to address the root cause, you can more effectively make the world a better place. It's like there's a lesson in that. And the film can do this because it isn't a fighting game that needs a final boss fight to cap things off, nor is it the climax of a very long comic series. The fight with the other Superman serves as both the climactic action sequence and a contrast with how much more effective bringing Lois in is. Of course, this outcome wouldn't really work in the other versions, given how many people, including heroes and at least one child, those Clarks have murdered. The comic version especially can never be redeemed, no matter how hard Prime Earth John Kent tries. And that's how Injustice's 3 conclusions to the regime arc, while evidently very similar, all operate differently to varying degrees of success. I think the ideal scenario is that one day there can be a new take on the concept, completely divorced from the needs of a fighting game roster or story structure that can do its own thing, be completely creator driven, and can learn from the way these 3 takes wrapped up to make a version that is satisfying narratively, thematically, and possibly even from a pure spectacle standpoint. And ideally not use the evil Superman or Batman vs Superman tropes because they are so overdone. If you were the one in charge of a new version, how would you approach its premise and climax? I've already given my concept many years ago. Discuss yours in the comments. If you liked this video, why not subscribe and support me on Patreon like these fine people here? You get early access to new videos for just $1 a month. If not, then make sure to share it with your enemies so they can suffer along with you. Today's recommended video is The Injustice Movie is Good Actually by Godzilla Mendoza. I've recommended this one before, but who else talks about how Injustice gets adapted into other media?